I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily Week in Review. The 38-country OECD is warning that Russia's war in Ukraine will disrupt commerce and clog up supply chains, slashing economic growth and fueling inflation globally. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development released the grim assessment on Thursday, and it says that over the next year, the conflict would reduce the broadest measure of economic output by 1.08% worldwide and by 1.4% in the European Union. But the organization says government spending and tax cuts could limit the damage. Meanwhile, the Conference Board of Canada has also come out with its analysis of how the war in Ukraine could economically impact Canada. With us to discuss that study is Mr. Pedro Antunes, Chief Economist at the Conference Board of Canada. Sir, welcome to Forum Daily.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, this war in Ukraine is clearly a humanitarian tragedy, but it also poses significant economic risks to Canada. So tell us a little bit more about the main findings of your recent report on this.
Well, I think importantly, as you just mentioned, this is going to have an impact on the global economy. It is going to have an impact on some of our important trade partners. Canadian and Canada, in fact, doesn't have a lot of economic or financial ties directly with Ukraine or with Russia. So we're spared those kind of direct impacts. But I think overall, the most important impact that we're going to feel from this is just this massive hit to global prices, raw material, food prices, and other prices. And that is going to stir up already hot inflation across the world and here in Canada as well. And that will be the major negative repercussion, I think, for most households. They're going to feel much stronger inflation. In fact, we think 1.2 percentage points higher than what would have been in a kind of counterfactual world without this war. So that erodes essentially our purchasing power. It takes down our consumer spending. It puts pressure on a lot of households. And at the same time, of course, higher inflation means that central banks will fight that with higher interest rates. So that is also going to put pressure on households.
On top of this, we're seeing oil and other commodities also experiencing a spike in prices. So tell us a little bit more about the impact on the Canadian resource industry as well, sir.
Well, this is where Canada has a bit of an offset. In essence, when we look at the long list of products that the Ukraine and that Russia essentially export to the world, these products are very similar to what Canada as a whole also produces. So when we think about energy, oil and oil and natural gas, so we're an exporter of those products. But down the list, nickel, copper, aluminum, potash, and of course, cereals and oil seeds. So all of these things, essentially, because of this global commodity price shock, are going to see a ramp up in price. And that means Canadian producers and exporters will benefit from those higher prices. So in all, when we look at the net impact on Canada's economy, we see it as a kind of almost a neutral this year, even a slight positive if you take a look at the benefits from these higher prices to our exporters.
And at the same time, with these higher oil prices, we're seeing federal and provincial governments increasing revenues. So how would that impact policymakers, sir?
Well, I mean, you just mentioned the OECD is calling for more spending to help offset some of this. That's what we've assumed in the kind of scenario that we've built. In essence, provinces benefit from higher royalty revenues. The federal government will benefit from the profitability of these sectors that I just mentioned. So we do see about 10 billion a year added to each of those levels of government. So provinces and territories on aggregate will see about 10 billion benefit. The federal government about a 10 billion benefit as well. And so we think some of that will be re-spent in the economy, and we've already seen some signs of that. Essentially lightening taxes on gasoline. We've seen some transfers back to households. So this is where it'll add a little bit to that to counter the negative impact on households.
All right, sir, just about 45 seconds left here, but where can our viewers go to learn more about this report?
Oh, well, thanks for asking. The Conference Board of Canada, you can find our website easily. Just Google the Conference Board of Canada.
All right, Mr. Antunes, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Coming up after the break, we take a look at inflation and the growing housing crisis in Canada. The senior features editor for the C2C Journal has examined how zoning laws may be affecting housing prices and availability. This in his recent article that we will be examining, titled How Private Property Rights Can Fix the Housing Crisis. Our interview with Mr. Peter Sean Taylor about housing affordability is right up next, and you don't want to miss it. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. There is no relief in sight from climbing prices across the country, with Statistics Canada saying the annual inflation rate hit 5.7% last month. This is the highest in more than 20 years, and the second straight month above 5%. Economists say gas prices, grocery costs, and housing expenses all contributed to the leap from January's setting of 5.1%. And polling shows that Canadians across the country consider housing affordability to be a major issue. While governments at all levels say the issue is a priority, housing prices continue to rise. A new investigative article suggests that municipal zoning laws may be the issue. Peter Sean Taylor is the senior features editor at the C2C Journal and the author of How Private Property Rights Can Fix the Housing Crisis. He joins us now. Sir, welcome to Forum Daily.
Pleasure to be here, Nima.
So what led you to investigate the issue of housing and property rights in the first place?
Well, as you mentioned in the intro there, certainly house prices have been a major issue in the past year or two, and going back much farther in Vancouver and Toronto, the really big housing markets in the country. People have been complaining house prices seem to be getting out of reach for many families, and the solutions pitched are always things like foreign investor tax or a house vacancy tax or special programs or subsidies or changes to mortgage standards, et cetera, all of which, as we've seen over the past couple of years, certainly haven't worked at all. The house prices are going up even faster now. So given that this is essentially a market problem of supply and demand, there isn't enough supply to meet demand, it made sense to me that there's going to be a market solution to it. And that brings you around to property rights.
And your article is pointing to municipal zoning laws as the main issue in housing affordability. So can you unpack that for our viewers?
Certainly, if you talk to anyone in the housing industry, developers, et cetera, people in the construction industry, the layers and layers of approvals, of consultations and studies and red tape and development charges, et cetera, that come out of the municipal level of government are really the blockages in terms of unleashing a lot of new housing supply. In Ontario, we've seen the Ontario Housing Affordability Task Force take on this issue of how can we solve the house price crisis, and the main conclusion from that report is that municipal rules are the big problem, and that the solution is to clear away a lot of these issues. The task force itself sets the goal of building 1.5 million new homes in Ontario by the end of the decade. So to do that, you're going to have to really speed up everything to do with getting new houses built, and that's approvals and studies and that whole range of things. So that's where the problem really lies, the blockage.
Mm-hmm. And your article is saying Ontario is discussing an as-of-right concept. So can you tell our viewers a little bit more about this concept and how it would be impacting the housing supply crisis?
Right. Well, the task force's centerpiece recommendation, I would argue, is as you said, as-of-right zoning. As of right means that you would remove a lot of the current zoning rules around residential houses throughout the entire province. The report recommends that anyone who owns a single family home right now would have the right, without having to go to their local city council and ask for zoning changes or whatever, would have the right to do almost whatever they want with that house. They could put a granny flat in the back, they could put a basement suite in the basement, they could turn it into a duplex, they could even tear it down and put up a fourplex up to 4 stories high on their land without their neighbors being able to complain, without city council putting rules on it. You're essentially unleashing the power of homeowners to do whatever they want with their property within certain reasons, right? I mean, it puts a 4-story limit on it, but really empowering homeowners to create new housing supply. And I think that's a pretty exciting idea.
Exciting idea indeed, sir. Now, on the other hand, do you think this concept might infringe or limit the autonomy of local governments?
Well, certainly you're going to get a lot of pushback from it. Because you're taking away the ability of municipal politicians to say what can happen in their jurisdiction. You would also be limiting the NIMBY community groups who don't like change.
Mm-hmm.
But there's another way of looking at this, and instead of taking away local control, we're actually giving more local control. We are giving control to the homeowners themselves, rather than to the municipal government directly above them.
Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland has hinted at more military spending. This is following moves from NATO allies to boost defense budgets to equal 2% of their domestic economies amid Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This conflict has changed the world since early February. This was when the government surveyed private sector economists about their outlooks to help underpin budget calculations. And with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, countries around the world are reevaluating their national defense budgets and priorities. With us now to discuss Canada's defense needs in the Arctic is Dr. Rob Hubert, maritime and Arctic security expert and a professor at the University of Calgary. Dr. Hubert, welcome back to Forum Daily.
It's my pleasure to be again with you.
Now, sir, historically, Canada has been criticized for its defense spending when it comes to NATO. So how does Canada compare to other NATO allies?
Well, at 1.4% or thereabouts, we're probably at the very bottom. I mean, there's a few countries like Iceland that spend less on us, but it's hard to find any of the substantial European countries and, of course, the Americans that are below us.
And considering that Canada shares the shores of the Arctic Ocean with Russia, how important is the Arctic region to Canada strategically, especially amid this war?
Well, it's one of the key elements. It's out of sight, out of mind, but people forget that it is the Arctic region that really offers the element of the protection against any form of, first of all, the Soviets and then the Russian nuclear strike. It's where deterrence is maintained. And to have deterrence work, you have to have the ability to know if your enemy is attacking you, in this case, the Russians. And that is an expensive proposition. And we haven't really done anything to update since about 1985 our capabilities.
And on top of that, we know Canada recently withdrew from the Arctic Council along with other members over this invasion. So what kind of impact would this have on Canadian security in the region?
Well, the Arctic Council was for cooperation. It dealt with environmental issues. It dealt with improving the situation and the voices for Indigenous northern peoples. And so it very specifically was not allowed to deal with security issues. This was one of the elements when it was being created. Now, what's going to happen, in my view, is that we can probably expect to see Finland trying to seek a membership in NATO, and probably Sweden will follow. I very much doubt that Russia will, even once the Ukrainian war is over, that even if we are willing to admit the Russians back into the Arctic Council, I doubt that the Russians will want to come. So we're going to see two different organizations being created. We'll see a Arctic Council, just like the G8 transform to the G7, and the Russians will probably create, and that will act to cement the divide between any cooperation.
We'll definitely have to keep our eyes out for that development, sir. But what do we know so far about Canada's current defense capacity in the Arctic?
Well, a lot of talk. We had a very well thought out Canadian defense policy that was issued back in 2017, Strong, Secure, and Engage, but we haven't done anything. The aircraft that we have is sort of our sword within the overall protection of the system, the F-18s. We got them back in 1978 to 1982. We've been talking about replacements, of course, haven't moved on it. As I said earlier, the North Warning System really cannot detect the new type of hypersonic missiles that the Russians are now deploying and are shown very capable of having in the ongoing Ukrainian war. And we have almost no maritime capability of being able to determine if, in fact, any of the new Russian submarines, or even worse, their underwater autonomous vehicles are coming. And so it's a pretty empty situation as far as the Canadian security is concerned.
Some very concerning information there, Doctor. Just about a minute left here, but what needs to be done to improve Canadian defense capacity in the Arctic?
Well, the first one is actually fund NORAD, like we said we were. We also have to look to have the capability of going to space-based assets, working with our American allies, and improving our underwater capabilities in terms of detecting the developing threats.
All right, Doctor, it seems like we've got about 30 seconds left here, but given the potential economic importance of Arctic resources, what would a good Canadian strategic policy for the Arctic look like over the next decade?
Well, right now, it only looks internally. Our Arctic policy is very much just on domestic issues. And so we're still kind of waiting for the Liberals to try to come up with something that can be said to be looking outwards. So we need to be aware of the threat. We also have to be aware of the environmental threat, which is equally dangerous to Canada. And quite frankly, we haven't seen any sign of being able to do either one properly, let alone trying to deal with both of them at the same time.
Lots of steps needing to be taken. Doctor, thank you again for your time today on Forum Daily.
Always my pleasure.
We'll be right back after the break with a look at how to cope with Omicron, as well as other variants of the coronavirus, as restrictions begin to lift all across the country. A recent conversation with Dr. Abhishek Raut, Medical Director of the Appletree Medical Group, is coming up next. So stay with us. We'll be right back shortly here on Forum Daily Week in Review. Stay tuned. A microbiologist says cases of the Omicron subvariant are increasing in Saskatchewan. Joseph Blondieu is the head of clinical microbiology at the University of Saskatchewan. He says the BA2 strain makes up 10% of all COVID-19 cases in the province, and it is expected to become dominant. Dr. Blondieu says people tend to have milder symptoms with this COVID-19 variant, but it appears to be more transmissible. He says the risk of hospitalization and death from the virus decreases with a third shot of vaccine. Meanwhile, pandemic restrictions have been lifting across the country, with health officials saying this is likely to increase case counts. Joining us now to give us his advice on how to stay safe amid the lifting of restrictions is Dr. Abhishek Raut, Medical Director of Appletree Medical Group. Doctor, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Pleasure to join you today.
So how does the BA2 variant compare to the Omicron variant in terms of symptoms and transmissibility, Doctor?
Right, so BA2 has several key mutations, with the most important of those occurring in the spike protein that studs the outside of the virus. These mutations are shared with the original Omicron, but BA2 also has additional genetic changes not seen in the initial version. People are looking at BA2 closely because it's probably more transmissible than BA1. But this difference between BA1 and BA2 is much, much smaller than the difference between Omicron as a whole and Delta as a whole. So some good news here is that the evidence so far suggests that infection with one of the Omicrons seems to provide protection against the other Omicron lineages and variants. And preliminary data does indicate that vaccinations and boosters are similarly effective in preventing symptomatic cases of BA1 and BA2.
It's always great to hear good news, Doctor. Now, we did mention restrictions are being lifted across the country. So how are you expecting this to impact case counts?
I think to answer that, we need to look to Europe, as many of the COVID-19 restrictions are relaxed across Europe, including Austria, Britain, Denmark, Germany, and France. The number of those infections have slowly inched higher in recent days. This uptick is driven mostly by the Omicron descendant BA2 and by people abandoning masks and gathering in big groups there. So in the last 2 weeks, we've seen that COVID-19 hospitalizations and deaths have both risen slightly in Britain. And I think it's likely what we've seen in Europe, we're going to see in Canada as well, with an increase in proportion of cases of COVID-19.
So do you have any advice on how Canadians can maybe stay safe while enjoying this shift to pre-pandemic life?
That's right. Well, there's an inherent miscommunication that sometimes occurs with lifting pandemic measures. People do believe that as pandemic measures are lifted, it means COVID-19 is gone. But as restrictions continue to be lifted, it's important to keep in mind that COVID-19 isn't gone. It's still very much present and can still be dangerous for at-risk individuals. So that means looking at activities that might be high risk, such as large gatherings, and taking appropriate evidence-based measures like still hand washing frequently and wearing masks when needed. And it also means keeping distance from friends and family who might be exhibiting COVID-19 symptoms.
All right, doctor. Well, considering that case counts are likely to increase, if someone were to catch the Omicron variant or subvariant, what steps should they take in order to get better at home?
That's a very good question. Keeping in mind, generally the symptoms for a mild case include runny nose, cough, shortness of breath, body temperature above 38, fever, body aches, and symptoms can also vary there from person to person. The most important thing you can do is self-isolate, essentially eliminating the number of people you can come in contact with so that virus doesn't continue to spread. Self-isolation should be done in a room where they're separated from everyone. If you are living with people, the recommendation at this point would be that everyone in the home should wear N95 masks to limit that further transmission.
All right, doctor, just about a minute left here, but are there any medicines or treatments that are available that we can use at home for the Omicron or subvariant of Omicron variant?
For milder symptoms, you can use medications like acetaminophen or Tylenol or ibuprofen or Advil, quite helpful in bringing down that fever. Cough syrups and decongestants are helpful in controlling the coughing and nasal congestion as well. Overall, plenty of fluids and healthy foods are very important to keep hydrated as well as to keep your energy up.
All right, doctor, and what kinds of symptoms should people look out for in case they might need to go to the hospital?
A very good question. So experiencing severe symptoms means chest pain or pressure, confusion, any altered state of consciousness, and most importantly, difficulty breathing or shortness of breath. If you have any of those symptoms, please consider going directly to hospital or calling 911.
Always an informative interview, Dr. Rao. Thank you again for your time today.
Thanks for having me.
All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news from this past week. And we'll see you again next time here on Forum Daily. Have a great weekend, everyone. Take care.